Hi guys, this is Group 1. Our group names are Maricruz, Amy, and Daniel. The name of our project is Civil Liberty Project. Our topic is freedom of speech and the press. To begin with freedom of speech and the press, we will be introducing a brief video.
Freedom of speech. The Founding Fathers named the first 10 amendments to the Constitution the Bill of Rights, the first of which guarantees some of the most fundamental freedoms of our country, including freedoms of press, protest, religion, assembly, and last but certainly not least, freedom of speech. The definition of free speech and its limits, such as censorship and hate speech, have been debated since the initial adoption of the First Amendment. Freedom of speech is considered a fundamental building block of liberty, allowing citizens to express their ideas and bring about the change that reflects the needs of the people. It also gives a voice to sometimes conflicting or dissenting opinions, which is believed to inspire the healthy debate that moves society forward. When drafting the First Amendment, James Madison and his colleagues drew from many of the great thinkers of the day. One of the most influential works in colonial America at the time was a collection of essays known as Cato's Letters. The writers were two British men, John Trenchard and Thomas Gordon, who wrote under the pseudonym Cato. Cato was one of Julius Caesar's chief opponents in the Roman Senate, known for his incorruptibility and defense of the Republic. They published 144 essays promoting liberty and criticizing the overreach of the English crown. In one essay, they wrote, "Freedom of speech is the great bulwark of liberty. They prosper and die together." This idea and others from the letters inspired much of the Constitution and Bill of Rights. From Madison's own notes, we know that he intended freedom of speech to be a natural right, not something granted by the government. Of course, free speech is not an unlimited right. And because the First Amendment doesn't establish what those limits are, we've spent centuries debating what is and what isn't free speech, a debate allowed by our right to free speech. The recent history of free speech can be traced through a long and winding path of landmark Supreme Court cases, so just strap in for a minute. Prior to World War I, the Supreme Court had virtually never ruled on cases on the freedom of speech and had done little to protect dissenting voices. Then, in 1919, the court decided in Schenck v. United States that the government was allowed to limit speech that would create a clear and present danger. In 1942, again in a time of war, the court limited protection for fighting words, speech that can provoke harm to another, in the case of Chaplinsky v. New Hampshire. The year after, however, in West Virginia v. Barnett, the court determined that making students recite the Pledge of Allegiance violated their free speech rights. In 1989, flag burning was ruled as protected free speech in Texas v. Johnson, as was cross burning in 2003's Virginia v. Black, unless it's being done to intimidate. So yes, free speech is certainly not as simple.
The right to express an opinion without restraint allows criticism towards the government. First Amendment protects you from the government doing things that try to deny your speech. Types of speeches: political speech, comments of government action. The most protected speech: symbolic speech, nonverbal speech that expresses an idea or emotion. Be able to wear armbands, signs, or t-shirts. Freedom of press could be limited to: no one is free to publish false information that would harm another person's reputation. Doing so is called libel. Shield laws help protect the reporter from having to reveal the source of their information.
Thank you very much. We're here today to defend free speech from one of the gravest dangers it has faced in American history, frankly, and you know what's going on as well as anybody. It's not good. A small handful of powerful social media monopolies controls a vast portion of all public and private communications. in the United States, and we know what they are. We don't have to name them. We're going to give you a complete listing. The choices that Twitter makes.
Here are some examples of quotes and art that represent freedom of speech and press. Freedom of press. The right to report news or circulate opinion without censorship from the government. It is enjoyed by Americans given that it is the right guaranteed by the First Amendment. Freedom of speech. Freedom of speech may not be recognized as being absolute freedom. It has limitations that relate to slander, sedition, pornography, copyright violation, dignity, public security, and more. Examples of freedom press. Journalists are allowed to write a critical article of the President of the United States without any backlash from the government. The news and the media are also able to publish any information or opinion they desire. Brandenburg versus Ohio, 1968. Brandenburg was a leader in the KKK, convicted of violating Ohio state for advocating criminal actions. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of Brandenburg. Speech and press do not permit a state to forbid advocacy of the use of force, except where such advocacy is inciting or producing imminent lawless actions and is likely to incite or produce such action.
Just how far does an individual's right to free speech extend? The 1919 court case of Schenck versus the United States was central in defining some of the limitations of free speech rights. You see, during World War I, the U.S. instituted a military draft in which 24 million men registered and 2.5 million were actually drafted into the military. This generated outrage from certain anti-war groups such as socialists, anarchists, and peace advocates. Now, President Woodrow Wilson was not a fan of the demonstrations or anti-war literature that some of these groups were generating. Wilson said, "Such creatures of passion, disloyalty, and anarchy must be crushed out." One such protester was Charles Schenck. He was a member of the Socialist Party and was responsible for distributing a leaflet urging recently drafted men to resist the draft. This pamphlet asserted that the draft violated the 13th Amendment, which prohibited involuntary servitude or slavery. He also condemned the federal government and the war. The federal government then arrested Schenck and charged him with violating the Espionage Act of 1917, which made it a crime to obstruct the recruiting or enlistment service. Schenck maintained that the First Amendment's free speech clause protected his right to criticize the government. The Supreme Court took up the question. Unfortunately for Charles Schenck, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously against him. They argued that wartime circumstances changed the rules related to the right of free speech. The court, in an opinion written by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., said, "We admit that in many places and in ordinary times, the defendants, in saying all that was said in the circular, would have been within their constitutional rights. But the character of every act depends on the circumstances in which it is done." The court also created the clear and present danger rule, a new test for free speech. The court decided the question in every case is whether the words used are used in such circumstances and are of such a nature as to create a clear and present danger that they will bring about the substantive evils that Congress has a right to prevent. When a nation is at war, many things that might be said in time of peace are such a hindrance to its effort that their utterance will not be endured so long as men fight, and that no court could regard them as protected by any constitutional right. From saying bomb on an airplane to yelling fire in a crowded theater, Schenck versus the United States is still applicable today.
Importance. Court established the belief that a person's rights are not absolute for all times and in all places. The right to free speech does not allow a person to shout fire in a crowded theater. The court's clear and present danger ruling allows two restrictions of individual rights in the interest of national security. These photos show some of the latest protests in the United States. Pickering versus Board of Education, 1968. Marvin Pickering, a school teacher, wrote a letter to an editor at the Lockport Herald complaining about the school board and how they were spending money. He was fired from the school board and brought the case to the Supreme Court, claiming that he was fired for his speech. 8-1 majority opinion holding the dismissal of violating his First Amendment. The Supreme Court noted that similar speech is not protected if it contains false statements, and there was no evidence that Pickering's statements were false.
In a case called Pickering versus Board of Education. It involved a high school science teacher from Illinois named Marvin Pickering. Mr. Pickering was upset that his high school science classroom was not finished. Instead, his school district had allocated far more money to building a new football stadium. Marvin Pickering thus wrote a letter to the editor to the Lockport Herald. In his letter, Marvin Pickering criticized school officials for giving too much money to athletics instead of academics. School officials weren't pleased. They fired Marvin Pickering for engaging in speech that was detrimental to the school system. For several years, he had to work in a Chicago soup factory to support his family as his case progressed through the court system. He lost all the way through the Illinois state court system, but at the United States Supreme Court, he achieved a stunning 8-1 victory. Writing for the United States Supreme Court, Justice Thurgood Marshall emphasized that public employees do not lose their free speech rights as citizens. Justice Marshall pointed out that public employees have a right to speak out on matters of public concern or importance, and that those issues of public concern are important for the public to hear. Justice Marshall also recognized that a public school teacher is an especially informed member of the public, and that the public has a right to receive information and ideas from those public employees who are best in the know. The net result is that the United States Supreme Court granted a great deal of protection to public employees who engage in speech on matters of public importance.
These photos show evidence of how freedom of speech has been recently used in protest. Tinker versus Des Moines, 1969. A group of students were asked to remove and were threatened to be suspended for wearing black armbands in protest of the Vietnam War. The court ruled that the First Amendment protected the students having free of speech. The school officials could not interfere unless if it disrupted the learning environment. In 1965, Americans were divided in the support of the Vietnam War, with protests running nationwide. The Tinker family, active in civil rights and anti-war movement, were committed to protect and freedom of speech and took the school district to court after the district court ruled against the Tinkers. The case was brought to the United States Court of Appeals, which resulted in a tie. Abe Fortas said that student expression cannot be suppressed when it doesn't interfere with school discipline. In this case, it was found that it was creating interference with school discipline.